I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. When you really want to know what's going on in the Middle East, there's no better person to turn to than Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's most well known for having served 5 United States presidents and knows more about what's going on right now between Israel and Iran than anyone I know. Ambassador Ross also has a new book out called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World, which touches on Iran as well, has a whole chapter on Iran. So welcome, Ambassador Ross. Thanks so much for your time today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
First off, I want to ask you about the strategic significance of this 12-day war and now ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Was the war a turning point in Israel-Iranian relations, or is it just a tactical episode in a longer proxy conflict?
I'm going to give you what is not meant to be a diplomatic answer, but may sound like it. The answer is both. It's both because the potential for a real change is there, not just between Israel and the Iranians, but in the region as a whole, because the Iranian proxy network has been decimated and Iran itself has been weakened. So long as this Iranian regime is there, there's not going to be any kind of real change in the Israeli-Iranian relationship because the fundamental hostility to Israel by this regime isn't going to change. It's part of its DNA. It's part of what defines it. But this regime, I'm not saying it's going to collapse anytime soon, but it is weaker now than it has probably ever been, at least since the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when it was still quite fledgling. Today, military leadership has been decapitated. The leadership of the Revolutionary Guard has been decapitated. Leaders of the Basij, which are the public militia that helps to preserve the regime in power, has also lost its top 2 leaders. The vulnerability of Iran has never been so great. Its airspace is completely compromised. Israel was literally flying freely over Iran. One of the things that made it easier for the U.S. to carry out its strike against Isfahan and the Natanz and Fordo was that Israel had cleaned the air defenses within Iran. So the vulnerability is there. And while I don't expect this regime to change fundamentally its attitudes towards Israel, I think it's going to be so preoccupied domestically with preserving itself that the potential at some point for a change in regime, or at least a collapse of this one, shouldn't be dismissed.
Do you believe that Iran underestimated Israel's response, or did Israel exceed its traditional defense posture?
Here again, I don't want to make this a habit, but I'm going to say both.
Yeah.
The Iranians for sure have misread and underestimated Israel. I would say not just the Iranians. If you look at Hassan Nasrallah, you look at Yahya Sinwar, you look at Khamenei, they all had the same thing in mind. They all read the divisions in Israel, starting with the judicial reform or overhaul, as indicating fundamental weakness. They misread it because they don't understand the nature of the Israeli civic culture. They don't understand that while a majority of Israelis have lost trust in the current Israeli government, at least prior to this war, it didn't change their civic identity. It didn't change their sense of community. It didn't change their commitment to each other. We've seen it in the aftermath of October 7th, but you see it in the Israeli military, and you see it among the reservists. You have units that have the religious Zionists on the far right of the same unit with secular leftists from Tel Aviv. When they're in the same unit, they don't think about their politics. They think about each other. You look at different communities that responded to the needs of Israelis in the north who were evacuated, and certainly the needs from the people in the south who suffered the devastation of October 7th. This government was extremely slow to respond to the needs of the people who were victims in both the north and the south. But the communities around Israel organized themselves to take care of them. It was stunning. This wasn't a governmental response. It was a public civic response. The Iranians, the Nasrallah and Sinwar, never understood the depth of that because they aren't in societies that have that kind of deep civic connection or community. They can't afford divisions because that's a threat to them and their regimes. So they misread that in Israel, which meant they thought it couldn't muster itself very easily. They understood, certainly after the killing of Nasrallah and the pager operation in Lebanon, that Israel had real capabilities. And even not just that, what Israel did twice after the night of April 13th in 2024, when Israel was hit by 300 cruise missiles, drones, and 112, 300 total, by 112 ballistic missiles. Yes, there was an American Central Command with British, French, Jordanian, Saudi, and Emirati roles. The Israeli ability to defend itself was one thing, which they underestimated. But then when Israel retaliated for that, even though President Biden said take a win, the Israelis then did something what seemed to be very minor. They took out the radar of an S-300 around Isfahan. It was a very interesting signal because that's very well protected because it was part of the nuclear infrastructure. And Israel was showing, if you think or have any doubts about us, we can hit Isfahan anytime we want because we just took out the defenses around it. But that's all they did. On the night of October 26th, on the night of October 1st, when Israel was hit, Iran launched 200 ballistic missiles, 18 misfired, 182 did not. 36 missiles penetrated Israel out of the 182. Some were allowed to hit in open areas, but they did damage, much like we've seen damage from the 12 days of war in Israel, because when you succeed, in that case, it was about 80% success ratio. In the 12 days, it's probably been close to 90% interception, but missiles that carry a payload of, in this case, a 1-ton bomb, they're going to inflict real damage. So the Israelis on the night of October 26 took out basically the strategic air missile defense radars. The radars are the brain of these systems. And that's what they did. So the Iranians should have had more of a sense. But I think they still underestimated it. And I think they still felt, with Trump showing he was interested in diplomacy, that basically they wouldn't face this or Trump would stop the Israelis. I think they misread Trump too. I think they felt that Trump's interest in diplomacy, not wanting forever wars, wanting to be seen as a peacemaker, I think they misread that. So the combination of all this led to what was a colossal surprise for them on the first night, losing the top 15 officers in the military and almost an exact equivalent in the Revolutionary Guard. All these guys thought they were in safe, secure, invulnerable places that were also secret. And they lost all of them. So this also is obviously, I think, sent a message to the Iranians that they don't know what the Israelis have penetrated and where they are.
You know, it strikes me, and picking up on a point you just made, that the Iranians, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they think they understand the resolve of Israeli society, but they just sort of don't. Is that correct?
They really don't get it. Look, it's very interesting. About 18 months ago, Nasrallah gave a speech. A lot of his speeches aren't that interesting. This one actually was interesting because he was explaining why they didn't need to do more than they were doing. At the time, they were firing missiles only into the very northern part of Israel and not at the urban areas. He said, look, we've driven the Israelis out. We've created new ground rules. But it's also a reminder, and he goes into history and says, the Jews aren't deeply rooted to this land. They came from outside. They're not deeply rooted to the land. And the subtext was, we can drive them out. And that's what we're doing. Qasem Soleimani had a strategic plan that he encapsulated as being a ring of fire. He was going to build a ring of fire, meaning Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, a ring of fire around Israel. And that, again, it was driven by the sense they're not rooted to the land, and we can drive them. All we have to do is raise the price of living there enough, and they'll leave. And that's what Nasrallah was saying. He literally says that. In his speech, he actually cites Herzl and Herzl's idea at one point on Uganda as proof. So it's not that it's completely disconnected from Israeli history, but it's a complete misreading of the history and the depth of identity and the depth of the ties to the land and to each other. So they believed in their own ideology. They were misled by their own ideology, and they paid the price for that. Sinwar thought he was an expert on Israel, having spent 22 years in Israeli jails, being fluent in Hebrew. He prided himself on it, but he saw the surface and didn't understand the reality. Nasrallah was the same. Nasrallah said in 2006 that Israel was like a spider web. You could easily tear it apart. They didn't understand the essence of Israel, and they're now dead.
They think somehow that the Israelis believe that they don't really belong there. And if you talk to any Israeli, the very essence of their being is that they belong there. And somehow even Khomeini failed to understand that, or fails to understand that.
I wonder whether that's changed now, but he certainly didn't understand it before. In the book on Statecraft 2.0, in the chapter on Iran, I read literally close to 50 of his Khomeini's speeches from the 1990s until today. Aside from being mind-numbing, there was an unbelievable consistency to them, and especially the way he would talk about Israel. He was convinced it was this kind of artificial entity. Again, they have an ideology that doesn't understand the world as it is, but it's also an ideology that rationalizes their rule. And so it's very hard for them to, in any way, be self-questioning about that or to doubt that. And they don't have people around them who are coming in to say, well, gee, that's not right. These are regimes where shoot the messenger is actually taken quite literally.
So what has changed now? We have this ceasefire for the moment. There's mixed intelligence reports as to what's really been damaged and what hasn't. What now?
First, let me start by saying these mixed intelligence reports are way too early. They're way too early to be drawing conclusions, and they're also extremely narrow. It's almost like they're about a laboratory. The Iran nuclear program is partly technical, for sure, but it takes place in an economic, technological, political environment. So when the 12 leading nuclear scientists are killed, which they have been, when many of the machine tools and the small plants that would be necessary to take highly enriched uranium, which the Iranians seem to have preserved, and turn it into something have been destroyed, when they don't know what the Israelis know, and they can't be confident that wherever they've tried to hide this, that it's something that is truly hidden from the Israelis, when they fear in the first instance that they have to be worried about preventing regime collapse because they've lost some of the mechanisms of regime control, and they know they have a public in the short term, maybe there was a bit of the rally around the flag syndrome, but the rationing of electricity and water is going to continue even after this and is a function of their mismanagement. They know they have a public that's already alienated, and they'll probably become even more repressive in the near term. Their preoccupation will be domestic, not on the outside. All that suggests they will be extremely careful about moving to reconstitute. That moving to reconstitute carries a big risk. President Trump today said it's decades upon decades. Whether that's true or not, he did say, but regardless, if we see them trying to reconstitute or trying to enrich again, we'll hit them again. And at this point, they can't doubt that. So the idea that because they've preserved highly enriched uranium, and maybe they have these small places where they have centrifuges, they can feed those into centrifuges, and they could rush to a dirty bomb, maybe in theory that's a possibility, but it is disconnected from the reality of Iran right now. That's why I find these conclusions way premature, far too technical, and too technically limited, and in a sense lacking in imagination. I'd also say, well, this was a DIA report that was, again, based on early assessments. I'm not even sure that the early assessments will hold up even from a technical standpoint. Because I read a different account today that if you look at the satellite pictures of Fordo, just Fordo as an example, before and after, it's not just the collapsed nature of the top of the mountain. It's that there are two visible entry points where the bombs hit, which meant they penetrated. You have to understand that the 12 massive ordnance penetrators that were used and hit the same site, these holes, over and over again. And the MOP is a 30,000-pound bomb whose fuse doesn't ignite until it penetrates deep underground. So if you see the entry points, that doesn't mean the explosion took place there. The explosion took place much deeper underground. Now, that explosion by itself, these centrifuges they had there, they're the most advanced ones they have. These are very delicate machines. You're spinning at a rate of about 700 miles an hour. It takes very little to disrupt them. The shock wave from the bombs, even if the bombs end up not exploding in the assembly hall or in the hall where they're operating, the impact is likely to destroy them. The destruction of the electricity going in probably creates a surge which will destroy them. Even the fact that the argument that we don't know for sure if it penetrated down into where the centrifuges were operating, that may be true. But even what I've just described suggests that the likelihood that the centrifuges there survive is quite slim.
So what will it take to wage diplomacy with Iran right now, if in fact that's what's next? You know better than anybody what it's like to negotiate. How is the United States and Israel going to negotiate with Iran now? What would be productive?
Well, I don't think there'll be an Israeli-Iranian negotiation. I do think there'll be an Iranian-American negotiation that will probably start indirectly. Either it'll be through the Qataris or it'll be again through the Omanis. I still don't discount entirely the possibility the Iranians could turn to the Russians to play this role, in part because it allows them to say, look, we have a friend of ours who is helping in this regard, and Putin has an interest in showing his value to Trump so that Trump won't support militarily Ukraine. Trump has not authorized any new assistance beyond what has been in the pipeline, which was authorized by Biden. That will run out relatively soon for Ukraine. And Putin can think that time is on his side, but in his mind, time is on his side only if Iran is squeezed because of a lack of resupply. We're still the most important actor in that regard, although the European Union is ramping up in a way that will have an effect probably by the end of the year. So Putin has an interest in showing, look, I can help you cement an outcome here. Whether Putin says this or not, the reality is there is an extraordinary tactical military achievement. There is a need to have a political outcome, and that isn't going to be provided by what is done militarily at this point. What's been done from a tactical military standpoint is extraordinary, but if the Iranians say, okay, there's no negotiation, then we'll bide our time. But eventually, Trump will leave office. Who knows what his successors will be like, and we'll rebuild. By the way, if you look again at Iranian behavior, when they make, as they have historically, tactical concessions when they feel they have to, it's because their attitudes will live to fight another day. And that would be a very likely mindset right now. So, okay, we don't have to rush to this. By the way, they won't rush to it because that's the one thing that would trigger renewed military action. That's the last thing they want. So if you really want to translate this into something more enduring with an understanding about this is what the nature of their nuclear program is going to be and what it will not be, and this is what the nature of their ballistic missile program is going to be and what it will not be, that has to be done through negotiations. Trump has a lot of leverage right now because he can say, I said to you before, there was a way to do this nicely and we'll do it diplomatically, so as I prefer, or there's a way not to do it nicely. You will not have a nuclear weapons program, which is another way of saying you will not preserve the option to have a nuclear weapon. That's what you're negotiating now. What does it take to ensure they don't even have the option to have a nuclear weapon? Well, one is no indigenous enrichment. That's one pathway. And I could see the Iranians going along with that, provided they had a face saver. So what would the face saver be? The face saver would be, we won't do it, but we want you to recognize that we have a right to do it. Under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have a right to do it. By the way, that's a misreading of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it's always been the Iranian position. It's a misreading because there's nothing in the NPT that says you have a right to enrich. What the NPT lays out is what you're permitted to do. It doesn't talk about rights. It talks about what you're permitted to do. You are permitted to develop the fuel cycle. You are permitted to do that, but you are permitted to do it under the terms of a safeguard agreement, which basically says, here's what you can have so that you have civil nuclear power, but this is what you cannot have, and we have to be able to monitor it so that you convert what you have for civil nuclear power into a weapons option. So in theory, we could acknowledge they have the right to enrich, provided it's very clearly understood that if they ever act on it, that will trigger military action by us.
Ambassador Ross, you talked about Russia. How does China factor into this?
China is also interesting in the sense that the last thing they want is a war there. Both Russia and China, they didn't rush to support Iran. Rhetorically, they said things, but they didn't do anything practically. Now, China, before this, did help them to reconstitute their ballistic missile producing capability. There should be an understanding with China now as a way of enhancing diplomacy. If they want to ensure that there's not a replay of what we've just seen, they can't be rushing to help them with the materials that would allow them to begin to restore their ballistic missile producing capability. Russia may, as I said, maybe they want to play a role in terms of helping to mediate. They might have had an interest in seeing a huge surge in oil prices, but that's the last thing that China wants to see. And Russia can't afford to alienate the Chinese. So the convergence of interest between us and China in terms of wanting oil prices to remain lower creates also an incentive for them to be supportive of what could be a negotiation. Maybe neither Russia or China want the U.S. to be seen as the sole arbiter of events, because this is another example of U.S. power in a contrast with theirs. They sat on the sidelines, they played no role. The U.S. is the one who's shaping this. And Israel paves the way for the U.S. to do it. So I think there is a potential for diplomacy now. A lot of it will depend on, do the Iranians decide it's in their interest to engage in reaching agreements? They will still want face savers, but the reason they have an interest in diplomacy is because their economic needs were profound before the war. They're greater now. Their public won't have a lot of patience for living what is a kind of rationing that they're dealing with today. So getting sanctions lifted is hugely in their interest, but to get sanctions lifted, they're going to have to make real concessions on their nuclear infrastructure.
Ambassador Ross, finally, I want to ask you about Israel. Many people are saying today, news reports, etc., that Israel is the winner here. They're the big winners. And I also want to ask you, is Benjamin Netanyahu also a winner?
From a military standpoint, the Israelis are a very big winner. From the standpoint of the exercise of Israeli military power, what's very clear in this region is Israel is the dominant force by far, but it's also more significant than that because Israel, since September, October of last year, Israel basically has decimated the Iranian proxy network, decimating the crown jewel of that proxy network, which was Hezbollah, which then led to the collapse of the Assad regime, which was the critical geopolitical, geostrategic land link from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon and Hezbollah. So the balance of power has been transformed. The map of the Middle East is different. And the leading Sunni states, the Saudis and others, will look at Iran now as being far weaker than it was before, much less capable of exercising any kind of coercion on them. It means that diplomacy in other areas, normalization over time, I emphasize over time because Gaza has soured Arab publics on Israel because of the death and destruction to Palestinians in Gaza. They have been hit with daily images. The images aren't false, they're real. In terms of the level of death and destruction, the number of victims, including women and children, that has had a searing effect on the public attitudes towards Israel in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region. Nothing can proceed unless you have an end to the war in Gaza, which I think is far more likely now. Not because Iran is weakened or Hamas is somehow sobered, but because Bibi is in a stronger position to basically make a decision to end the war in Gaza and not be limited by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. For him, he has won, you answered your question. This is a significant victory for him, but it's an incomplete victory. Because as long as the hostages are in Gaza, this is not a complete victory, and the Israeli public wants that over. And yesterday you had 7 Israelis killed in an APC that was blown up by a bomb that got attached to it. The public sees Gaza from that standpoint. The social compact in Israel has always been one of the reasons, by the way, you have this civic identity and civic culture, is because the social compact was, we, the government, if we lose people or they're taken, we will move heaven and earth to get you back. That's part of the social compact. That's been shaken because of the way this government approached the hostage issue, by clearly not putting it as the first priority, but ensuring that Hamas was not in control of Gaza as the first priority. 3/4 of the Israeli public say, end the war so you get the hostages. Bibi today is in much stronger position to do that, not only for the reasons I said, but for one other reason. If he says, we're ending the war, we provided the hostage release, we will get out, Hamas cannot be in control, and if we see Hamas beginning to reconstitute itself, we will hit it again. Nobody will doubt that now. By the way, that's exactly what they're doing in Lebanon on close to a daily basis. So why can't he do it in Gaza?
Ambassador Ross, a lot of people might not remember, but just a couple of weeks ago, Bibi Netanyahu's government was in danger of falling.
Right.
He has been extraordinarily dependent on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Does this victory make him a little bit less dependent on them?
I think significantly less dependent on them in just general terms. But I don't know if you noticed, in the last couple of days, there was also speculation coming out of quarters close to Netanyahu, close to the prime minister, about possible early elections.
Yes.
If he's leaning towards early elections, he is not only not dependent on them at all, because it means he's already less concerned about the sustainability of the government. When he was negotiating to get legislation that would lead the Haredi to not leaving the coalition on the issue of the exemption or the draft of the ultra-Orthodox, he went to great lengths to preserve the government. Now, if there's talk, I'm not saying he has decided on early elections, but it's clearly coming out from people close to him, which means at least he's thinking about it. He doesn't have to fear the fall of the government under those circumstances, but there's even something more basic than that. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, at that point, he looks at them as competitors for right-wing votes. He's not interested in appeasing them. He's interested in competing with them. And it's interesting, the most recent polls show a surge for Likud, but a drop for Ben-Gvir. Smotrich was already low. It means those supporters for Ben-Gvir, they're going to Bibi. They're not staying with Ben-Gvir. We're seeing a movement not between the blocs, but within them. In the past, we've seen that on the center-left. Now we're seeing it on the right. That may affect Bibi's choices as to when he's prepared to go for an election. Think about it, even the hint that he might go for elections, that immediately builds his leverage on Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, because it tells them, I'm not afraid of your threats. Make my day. So he's no longer dependent on them.
Ambassador Ross, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time, for your thoughtful analysis, and for really helping us understand what is going on following this 12-day war. Thank you so much.
It's really my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.